Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for the invite, and thank you for your interest in the subject of the families of those who are injured in the service of their country, but in the service of humanity. And in so doing, the casualties are not just on those battlefields or those complex theaters of operations, but there are enormous casualties back home. And I think to just set the intro of this is that contrary to what we have lived in the past, the families are intimately linked to the operational capability of our forces because they are intimately linked with the missions that we do. When I returned from Rwanda in '94, my mother-in-law was still living at the time, and she said, I wouldn't have been able to survive World War II if I would have had to go through what Elizabeth did in the family. My father-in-law commanded a regiment, an infantry regiment in World War II, served overseas for nearly 5 years. And during that time, one, there was censorship, so there was not much information. Two, the technology and so on was very limited, so there was very little information coming back. So they really were quite separated from the war and got bits here and there as they could, and did not really sense, apart from the letters, which were also censored, if you remember, what was going on over there. Until on some terrible day, some of them, too many, a padre would arrive at the door to tell them, or a Western Union in this country a message. However, our families are in a whole different world. Our families are now living the missions with us. It's not just that they're being informed, they are literally living the missions with us. Why? Because one, the revolution in communications, which has even become stronger than it was 15, nearly 20 years ago when I was deployed, but because of the ability of the information through the media to be projected back and in enormous detail. And this desire of keeping families informed because we feel that that's what they absolutely want. And in so doing, however, they are also living the stresses of these missions. Whenever an operation is ongoing, whenever somebody's been killed, whenever there's casualties and so on, a whole garrison will find themselves in a state of stress because first they don't know which one was killed and who is, and then finally that comes through, and then the impact of that and the like. But interestingly, it's not just the spouses who are living the missions, as they are quite sensitive. The children are too, who are far more astute into what's going on because they're being fed that information or in front of all the different tools of communications, and so they're also aware. And so when we come back and we are affected by these missions, we realize that we walked into a house, and yes, they can say, you know, geez, that's not the same dad or that's not the same husband I had before I left. But we can also say, that's not the same spouse or the same children I had when I left either. And so part of the overarching looking at commitment of forces is the fact that you are committing the families too. That is still a cultural sort of bridge to be crossed by DOD, MOD, and our own Ministry of Defense, and to different levels, the military themselves and the military leadership. There's lots of talk about how the families are so important to us being able to be effective, but when it comes to actually wanting to put that into policies that make that link and that intimately create that link between the family, the member, and the theater of operations and the subsequent support that they all need, there's where the breakdowns go, and there's where we go back to the stereotype, and you swear sometimes you're back after World War II or Korea, where in fact the families, as in the days, and it was ebbing when I entered the forces, the seniors would say, if the army wanted you to have a family, they would have issued you one. And so that easy, facile, irresponsible thinking or culture is latent still as we move the senior leadership and the institutions and the policies and the funds to realize that you're not just committing a member. You're committing the family, and you have a responsibility to ensure that that family recovers also. That the family re-becomes operational also. And so we'll touch upon that. But I've got 2 slides before PowerPoint. I am a general officer, so of course there's absolutely no way I can give a speech without PowerPoint or Keynote or whatever is out there right now these days. And so I'm limited though because of time, and as I've said before, a retired general who's an apprentice politician, brevity is not our strength. So he's going to throw something at me when it's time to, so I only brought 146 slides. But what I'm going to try to describe with this thing is complexity and ambiguity out there. This is no more somebody in a different uniform from a different country who is trying to create havoc in the world, and that you feel that you are intimately participant in trying to protect against this force. We are in a far more complex and ambiguous world where it's not nation states against nation states as much as it is imploding nations, failing states, civil wars, mass atrocities, and even genocide. That is far more complex. And it's interesting that the World War II veterans and the Korean veterans back home, they're the leaders of those different groupings at conferences that we had with Veterans Affairs would constantly come up and say, yeah, we had it rough, you know, in Falaise Gap, and we had it rough in the different theaters, and it was difficult. But it wasn't as complicated and so full of ethical, moral, and even legal dilemmas as what these guys are going and girls are going through now. And they feel it is far more complex and difficult, and the impacts are going to be that much more because of the nature of conflict now than it was in classic war. So that's not even us saying it. It is, in fact, those who've served before us and are showing deference to the new generation of veterans. And I speak mostly of since the end of the Cold War, when so many countries actually went catastrophic. So this is to show you just a feel of the players in this new era of conflict, and I've separated this from the other ones. And so these are military symbols, and it's not necessarily important to know the symbols as much as to know that they're different, either headquarters, and they all represent a whole bunch of people doing a whole bunch of stuff. And we're talking thousands here. And so you get the military structure, and it's fairly classic, and then you get the higher headquarters, which are not classic, because particularly if you're working for the UN, that's not a classic organization. And then you get other elements that are now integrated into the missions, because it is no more a sequential exercise. The old wars were the diplomats went in, as we have a diplomat here, try to sort it out, doesn't work out, they turn to politicians, say there's got to be another way, politicians turn to generals, you go out and sort it out, we take the youth of the country, we go fight, win, and then we hand it over to the development people, to the Marshall Plan type thing. And so it's very clinically sequential. Problem is that since the end of the Cold War and in the conflicts we're in now, it is all concurrent. It's all going on at the same time. And so we come up with these terms, three-block war and all these types of great terminology. But essentially what we're into is a multidisciplinary exercise of people who are not used to working with each other and often are at odds with each other and in friction versus in synergy. And so we're still on-job training in this era. Afghanistan is still on-job training. We're still learning lessons from that. And so because of that, and we've been at it now for about 20 odd years, contrary to classic war where we've been at it since Westphalia, which is at least 3 centuries, there is still a lot of ad hocery. And there's still a lot of missed opportunities and errors and in fact loss and casualties because of it. And that reflects all the way down to the private. And it is not only in the realm. So you start seeing from a classic sort of military mission, I got a mission in my structure, that you get these other players which are very civilian dominated, and then you get another whole set of group of people who are involved in different elements of the mission. It's not that they're administrating, they're there in the mission to do specific tasks in humanitarian work or political work. And then you get the different types of agencies, international and national, that get involved. And then you get the different sort of entities that are feeding into all those people, administrative and so on. And that gets to be a little complicated because you'll be in friction. You know, it's not your military logistics, it's a civilian outfit, and how do you work with them and who do they really respond to? And then you've got, of course, all the different substructures which are both police and military, but also humanitarian development that are deployed out there. And then you've got all the different NGOs that are out there, and there are thousands of them, and they've got a lot of stuff to provide, and they're quite engaged in the exercise. And then from all that you get then an additional sort of input of regional capabilities. We got to remember that there are local people there too, and their organizations. And then of course how you divide all that up into different organizations, integrating all them, and then ultimately you keep bringing on these different structures from governmental, and then you get the bad guys and the good guys, and you got to work with them. And then you get the real jerks, you know, the really bad guys who come in. That's a mission. So I stand there as commander of a mission, and I look at this and I say, I'm going nuts just looking at this. And this is why we're into an era of ambiguity and complexity. Because on the one hand, it is all working in a concurrent scenario, and two, we don't have all the tools. We don't have the doctrines. We don't have the fundamental conceptual framework of how all this should work together, how this is to be in synergy. When we were interviewing General Petraeus when he was in command overseas, and I'm the deputy chair of the Veterans Committee in our Senate, and I said, General, I said, what are you doing with the NGOs? He said, nothing. They don't want to talk to me. And so out there in the field right now, current operations, we are still trying to figure out how it works, and those are going to have impacts, of course, on us all. So I thought I'd throw up that very simple slide to give you a taste of what we're going to be involved in. The second slide I wanted to throw up, if I may, is one, it's a household one. And I hope it comes. I hope this comes up. Forgive me for trying to make it work. It's not going to come up. What it is I was at the Shoah event in New York for the Shoah Foundation here, and I was introduced by the president to Jerry Seinfeld, Jon Stewart, George Clooney, and I keep forgetting the girl's name who's in that film he's with. Right, and so and I had a great time. And they collected a whole whack of money. But my staff at the Child Soldier Initiative, who had been spending the day with me in New York, were really, really mad that I didn't swing an invitation for them. So you can't always win even when you're trying to do your best. So let's get into, if I may now, the actual move of the subject and the subject at hand. And I'm trying to keep us focused on the fact that we are speaking of injured people. We're not speaking of sick people. This is not a disease, it's not a sickness, and in fact we're horrified by even when somebody is talking about mental health, because that encompasses so much more. And so we're talking about people who are injured, and we call it operational stress injuries, of which PTSD is one. Depression and all other traumas are all components thereof, but certainly the PTSD is at the higher end. So the first point is that we're talking about injured people who can be brought back to a level of effectiveness. However, they will only be done to that if we have a sense of urgency to it. And this is the second point. If somebody's arm is dangling, how long do you think it takes for the MASH units and everything else to get at that arm and to prevent it worsening? When the gray cells have been fried, for PTSD does destroy elements of the brain physically. So when that happens and you can't see it, do we have that same sense of urgency? Do we feel that same need out there? Of responding to that requirement. And so what I am arguing here is that there is an absolute requirement of sense of urgency in looking at these injured people and those who are peripherally affected by them and may be also injured by this injury. This injury spreads by its impact on people around it. And the last point, the third element of this, is that this injury can be terminal. People die because of PTSD. They die because they kill themselves. So suicide is a real element of this injury. It's not going to happen necessarily in the theater of operations, but it can happen. Out of the 12 officers that were sent to me at the start of the genocide from Canada when everybody else was running away, 9 out of the 12 have had catastrophic breakdowns of PTSD. And 1 committed suicide 5 years ago, which is 15 years after. And I am in my 13th year of being very proud, like Woody Allen in his movies, of having a psychiatrist and a psychologist. Because it's in to have therapists. I mean, it is. I mean, you're talking, oh, mine does this and this and that. And secondly, I am always in awe of the great universities we have, particularly in North America, where we produce great chemists, because they produce great dope. And so I always have a lot of time for our psychiatrists too, because they give us the ability that I got these 9 pills a day that keep me reasonable. Don't keep me necessarily sane, but keep me reasonable. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we're not talking about something that you might catch and something that you can wash your hands of. And you're talking about an injury that can be lifelong, too often is, can spread by the people around. It has a terminal element. My last point on this comes from the family side. We have now been picking up more and more data on the fact that teenage children in particular of service personnel, male or female, who have been injured by operational stress injuries are committing suicide because they cannot survive in that environment. And because the country has not been at war, classically, they don't necessarily get the school support or the understanding there. They don't get the local people around them support because they may not be living on a base, particularly if you're in the Guard or reserves or so on. And so also this type of injury creates such traumas in the family that it looks just like a family that's becoming dysfunctional, and you don't necessarily want to talk about that. And so because of that, they become very isolated, they are hard to get at, and ultimately they are taking their lives. This is not insignificant. When we send those members overseas and they come back with this injury, we can be causing casualties in their family. That's an intimate link. And that's an overriding philosophical framework under which we've got to be functioning. You can't just treat the member. If you don't have a means of getting at the family, then the member, one, may never really fully recover, and your efforts may be, in fact, at times wasted. And so without the family having been reviewed and having access to an equivalent level of urgent response to their needs, you're going to create a disconnect in the two. They've been affected while you're away, and now they're affected while you're back. And that even could be more exacerbating. And I'll end with the following. As Anthony indicated, my father was a professional soldier, joined the Army in 1929. My future father-in-law joined the same regiment in 1928, but he was as a lieutenant. And he served overseas 6 years. We lived hell in our family. He became alcoholic. And it was never ever predictable what we would find when we come home. What would be the framework in which he would be in order that we can talk, we can laugh, we can even ask a question. And this was constant. And I remember very, very vividly defending my mother against him because he had become violent, and I was 12 years old. I remember having to go into the garage because he was of mechanic background, in the back of the house, because there was a phone call for him, and after he had had a horrific tirade, and we were all upset, and everybody's going and crying all over the place, and I had to go to the garage to get him to come to this phone call. But when I went to the garage that day, he was whistling. That really pissed me off. But when I got closer to him, he was also crying. Because he knew what had happened, but he couldn't stop it. And so the only days that we felt reasonably at home, at ease, and serene, were the days where he went that afternoon to the Legion, where he spent 2 or 3 hours with his buddy. And he brought me a couple times, and I would watch them. They're sitting 5 or 6 guys around a small table, and it's chock-a-block with beer. And they would all be talking and laughing their head off at some anecdote, or one would be crying and the others would be supporting him. But that night, we would be serene. He would be serene. Not because he was pissed, but because he had had his therapy. And that's all they had, to be able to talk to their own. And so that was classic war. Imagine what these people are coming back with, and how even more complex, and how the family has also gone through the trauma of that period, and now is even traumatized that much more by the individual being back. So I've still got 145 slides, so I better get at it and work on this with you. And only to situate you with, I always love using great American philosophers. There is a concern that you should have in regards to how people are looking at the future in regards to the realm in which we're involved with, which are veterans, military, and their family. And why I bring that up is that there are still a bunch of people who think that what's going on now is a bit of an aberration. That the last 20 years of these types of conflicts and the complexities and the causes are not the norm. That we'll go back to classic Cold War scenarios of big armies against big armies, and we'll be just, you know, holding each other at bay. And those people are now undermining the funding exercises of sustaining this. And so I raise this because the future ain't what it used to be, because it's going to continue to be complex and difficult, because the missions are going to continue to be complex as we respond to them, because we're still learning from the political all the way down and trying to figure out. But also what adds to that complexity is the waning desire to provide the support, because the nation's not at risk and there are other priorities. And so soft targets like health, families, and so on can be sources of budgetary cuts, and at a time when in fact those budgets have got to be increased. For the real casualties of these conflicts, be it Afghanistan, Iraq, right now, and the missions are coming after the conflict, not as much during. We've got physical casualties and some psychological casualties, no doubt. But the real casualties come when the troops know that they're no more under the strain or under the sort of high adrenaline rush of staying operational, because they're going to a next mission, and they want to continue to serve, and so they are putting in the back of their mind, they're hiding that injury. But when that demand is not there anymore, when they've returned to garrison to lick their wounds, then this stuff starts to come out. And so we are going to continue to see an escalation of casualties on the psychological side due to missions that have been now, or ebbing now, and ending soon. And so it is not the time for those budgets to be cut. On the contrary, it is in fact to increase them to meet the requirement. So I've showed a bit these new arenas that we're into, and how they're so much more complicated and difficult, but they are very human driven. And the thing I wanted to raise here is not only how we're trying to figure out how even at home the impact of that, and these idiotic things are still there, but the fact that it is human beings that are the targets now. It's not gaining territory, it's not gaining a bridge or something. The targets now are human beings. And so they are either targeted for destruction or they're targeted to build capacity. The Rwandan extremists moved just under 4 million people to build the power base they needed in order to be in a better negotiating position. So how do you feed 4 million people twice a day? And how do you take care of those as refugees, and how do you prevent them from being recruited to sustain the subversive operations and the like? So we're seeing not classic military targets with tanks and so on being blown up. We are seeing human beings being used and destroyed throughout. And the call to arms is not like it used to be. The countries are no more at war. The countries are into selective wars. It could be for resources, it could be for power sharing, it could be a sense of threat, yeah, like Afghanistan was with Al-Qaeda, but it is not a convincing argument for the whole of the country in its commitment. And you live that in spades with Vietnam. And so the country is looking at it differently now. However, there is still this fact that the whole country is not at war, and the whole family is not what it used to be either. This sort of neat picture, how many of you have been able to pull those off? And so the question is who is married in here? Who is sort of a common law spouse? Are all these kids from the same marriage, or 2 or 3 or 4? Are there an extended family all over the place? And on and on and on. So the fundamental structure of the family is what? What is the family now? It is in itself a very complex mixture of a whole bunch of different relationships that are there. Everything from the single guy who's still at home all the way to those who are in their third marriage and have maybe 8 or 9 kids all over the countryside, and God knows what other elements, including those who are not married. So that picture also is out of the picture. However, policy people tend to like to use that. And that might work for a lot of the population, but it doesn't work necessarily to 100%. And this is why I bring it here. We are in the business of human beings. We're not in the business of trucks. If I'm in the business of trucks, if I got a truck that can be 90% of the time on the road with little maintenance and fuel costs, I've got a damn good truck. In the case of human beings, the only percentage that is acceptable is 100%. For every one of them is an individual. Every one of them is a human being. So that your whatever policy you brought in is working to 90% or 85% or so on is a policy that is not achieving the aim. That 10% is going maybe catastrophic. And that's not allowed. And so that is the standard by which the world in which we're involved have got to work with. I personally went public with my PTSD in 1997 and did it at a press conference. I was a 2-star at the time, and all the medical staffs were under my responsibility, and the medical staff had come to me and said, we've had a rash of 11 suicides and we've determined between us and the legal people that they were not due to the missions they were being committed to. The missions were a factor. They were a factor. There were other predisposition situations that seemed to have been exacerbated by the mission. So it's not really the mission. And so in 1997, we were into an exercise of ensuring that we wouldn't be held accountable for that. And I knew what had happened to me. And so at that press conference where I was supposed to say these 11 suicides were not due to the missions, I said these 11 suicides are due because of the missions. Went public, gotten shit, but anyways, we've been working since then. And so I tried to be more scientific, and Anthony is telling me to slow down, but no, I know. Very rapidly, this is Dallaire's curve on stress in a normal military career. And this is peacetime soldiering. This has been, and which a lot of us have been involved in, certainly during the Cold War and so on. And so, in the middle of your years, there are more stress because of the kids don't want to move and so on, and spousal employment and all that. And this is a decent life. It's not very, very much different than on Civvy Street that we see. However, this is what we stumbled into. And this is where we failed. And we are still trying to grapple with it. And where we failed is the fact that we have never yet found that solution to bring that family down from that incredible stress because of the nature of the missions and the impacts and the risks to a level where they find that it is an acceptable experience. It's been tough, but we learned from it, we got closer, so on. The system is there, we've been supported, and yeah, we'll be ready for the next one. And so instead of sustaining a capability, we've in fact seen capabilities being destroyed because we've never grasped how to bring the individual and the family down to this sort of manageable level of stress and impact. And that's where this whole family dimension comes in. There is no way those soldiers or those serving members will be able to bring that curve for themselves, let alone their families, down to something workable if the family is not integrated in the support. And so you've lived the horror of Vietnam. And I think it's extraordinary how we're showing deference to Vietnam vets now in all the arenas. And it's but did nothing for the families, but we certainly, and not much for them either, but we at least are showing a different perspective of them. I think Forrest Gump helped us a bit there too, but anyways, all I'm indicating here is that these missions continue to kill. That figure here is dated 1997. When I went to your Veterans Administration Center on PTSD at White River Junction, Vermont, where Dr. Matthew Friedman is the head of it. And when I said we needed help, he said, we don't want you to go through what we did with Vietnam. And he said there are 58,000 some odd names on that extraordinary monument. But at that time, those recorded were 102,000 suicides related directly to Vietnam and counting. And so this is the dimension in which you are in. You're into a dimension where, because I have to conclude, I don't want to, but I have to, the answers are work hard and with time it'll go away. That's what I got when I came back after a year in conflict zone. Work hard and with time it'll go away. Work hard was driving myself into the ground, trying to kill myself at work, literally. And secondly, it wasn't going away, it was coming back digitally clear, in slow motion, and I was reliving it, be it because of a cloudy day, somebody said something, a smell, and so on. And it's not going away. There are mornings I get up and I swear the genocide happened this morning. And so what we need is therapy, professionals who are capable of handling this crowd, which is a very culturally different crowd than your civilian population, including the families. Children in the military are different. They're more independent. They've moved around more and so on. They are different than just kids from the normal school community life. And so there is a requirement for that support, professional support. Absolutely essential. The professionals have got to go out and sell their wares to those soldiers, their clients. You don't force them in the door, but you don't work from a black box of which they're afraid of. You go sell your product and let them come in. Secondly, the medication side of the house, where it's required. If somebody's got diabetes and takes insulin, I don't see that any different than me taking my 9 pills a day to be able to work during the day reasonably and sleep at night. So the acceptance of those therapeutic needs. And the third element of how we can handle this is by peer support. Peer support. Any clinic that has professionals that doesn't have a peer support body that is advising the clinicians but also following through between these different sessions and sitting there for 4 hours and not asking a stupid question and just listening and listen and cry and laugh with them but never ask a question, those peer supports are the reinforced, they're your force multiplier of the professional therapy. You've got to build solid peer support capability for them, because living between those sessions can be hell. And lastly, you've got to help them build the family prosthesis. You lose a leg, you know what a prosthesis is. You got to build a prosthesis for the family where they know we don't talk of these subjects. We don't go to these places. We know where the tripwires might be. We're sensitive to the environment. And with time, we will be able to make that second nature. And so building the prosthesis for the family as well as the individual who is affected is a fundamental component of bringing about a normalcy. You'll never bring them back to where they were, but you'll bring them to a normalcy that they will live and probably thrive. And heaven forbid, they may even turn into politicians. Thank you very much.
We have about 10 minutes for questions, so please, this is a great opportunity for you to ask your question, but remember the general has artillery ears, so you need to speak up. Please, any questions? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm listening.
Hi. That was wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. So, there seems to be, there's a real heavy reliance on pharmacological solutions that a lot of veterans are really rejecting because it's numbing their lives versus actually helping their lives. So, there's a lot of, and even in the VA, there's some exciting movement happening around mindfulness practices and more meditative practices, and I wonder, I mean, that might fit into the professional support that you were talking about at the end there, those 4 kind of pillars, but I would love to hear your thoughts on that, and specifically the over-reliance on pharmacological solutions.
Yeah. You haven't found, what the hell? Sorry. You haven't found the pill, right? The PTSD pill?
Right.
It's not there yet. And so there's a number of them that are doing, some are doing much better than they used to, and so on. So there is an initial requirement to assist the member in realizing that they're going to be a bit of a chemical factory for a while. In fact, they're going to be a bit of a laboratory. And that there are a period, in my case took nearly 2 years, of trying to find what that combination was for me to be able to not be a zombie, be reasonable, and achieve it. And that, I'm afraid, is the weakness of the pharmaceutical side, is we haven't found that shot there. And so they must be prepared to go through this and be prepared to respond, but the clinicians have got to also be quite prepared of not sustaining the pharmaceutical solution when they can see the individual is in fact being put at risk by turning into something they don't want to be. You want the pills to simply stabilize them, get them to sleep, and get them to be able to handle as much as you can that way. Then hand them over to the psychologist. You've got to bring them to a level that they can be handed over to the psychologist, who will then move them to the next step of being able to live with that injury. And so I came to the conclusion, it took years, and because there was just nobody figuring it out how to explain to me, it took years to realize that if a diabetic takes insulin and can live with that problem, then I can take pills and be reasonable. I also use the expression that you don't want to see me without my pills. You really do not want to see me without my pills. Ergo, it's true, it's not the real me, but it is a me that is an entity that is reasonable and can then logically think and do things and be able to be productive and also sustain yourself. Being you without the pills is just, it's an injury that's a festering wound. And it's got to be sold in that type of terminology, I'm afraid. And I'll end with this. Some who are from extreme elements, special forces guys, who got to keep in physical shape, and I don't want any of this chemical stuff, and fight that. The argument is that you will never be like that anymore, because you've been injured, buddy. You have an injury. And so it has taken away capabilities that you had before. So you're not going to be like that. So stop imagining it. You can be, however, effective with that, and it has no stigma to it. It's just a requirement of your life.
The general speaks of psychologists. He also brings social workers into that conversation. We had this discussion yesterday. So when he says psychologist, he means social workers.
I'm giving you my short answers. And the social worker and psychologist, I like to use the example of this guy who all of a sudden put his hand on a hot plate and burns his hand. The psychiatrist looks at this and says, geez, it's hurting and it's the skin and all that. So they'll give you the tools to reduce the impact of the pain and the abnormality of what is there. And that's essential, because without that you're still freaking out with all this pain and so on. The psychologists, the social workers, and their integrated capabilities, they're the ones then who turn to the individual after they've been able to stabilize their hand and say, why don't you put your hand on that hot plate? That's where the payoff is. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Since I was over there in 1965 in Vietnam, I came back with PTSD and the most dreaded disease they had, Agent Orange. And ever since then, I think, well, I know, I get a report about once every year. They started off with 2 diseases, which was diabetes and something else. Now they're up to 14. And what is happening, the people I went over there with in 1965 to 70, 40% of them are already dead.
Yeah.
They're dying out faster than anything else. They're dying out faster than the World War II vets.
Yeah.
And it's the Agent Orange part of it, plus the PTSD. And no pill will do anything for you.
No. And
people forget one thing about Agent Orange. It was a defoliant. It killed trees and junk.
no, we're very familiar with it. Yeah. Remember the Gulf War syndrome?
Yes.
Okay. What did we do when they came up with the Gulf War syndrome? Did we actually try to not only figure it out medically, but did we also, and from the legal side, look at it and say, is it due, and do we have a responsibility for compensation for people who've got this Gulf syndrome that is very difficult to define? Did we then, with those uncertainties there, turn to them and say, listen, we're not sure what it is, but you are due a compensation. You've been injured, and we're still trying to figure it out as Agent Orange is still making its way. We didn't do that. We gave them a hard time. And we keep giving them. And we just recently compensated people for Agent Orange from Canadians who were in Vietnam. And so we keep giving them a hard time. Why? Because the lawyer and the pure clinician, medical person, can't come with that technical answer to make the policy people feel warm and fuzzy, and so they decide not to do them. Versus the human side is saying, we can realize this problematic, and we have a responsibility to compensate. Yes, sir.
Paul Fries with Public Counsel. We have a major project focused on promoting the veteran treatment courts, which are designed to extricate veterans with PTSD who act out in ways that get them admired in the criminal justice system and get them into community-based treatments. It's a major movement. USC has been a wonderful partner in that. I'm from the Vietnam era myself. I was not in combat, but back then the stigma of PTSD was such that there was a culture of denial. So the wounded warrior came home, self-medicated because they didn't want to accept help. We didn't even have a diagnosis for PTSD. Then gets in trouble with the law. Now you have a criminal record. Now you're unemployed. Now the economic distress begins to break up your family structure. Now you're further depressed, further suicidal, traumatized children if the family does break up. Then stints of homelessness, unemployment, and now we have about 233,000 of our veterans in our jails and prison, most hailing from the Vietnam era.
Yeah.
That's the cycle that we're all trying to break here today, and I applaud you for helping elevate the awareness of PTSD. One of the staggering statistics I saw recently is that we have about a backlog of 700,000 veterans waiting for benefits determinations, many of whom self-identify as believing they have PTSD. Now that's counter to the culture that we've had many, many years ago, but it's also an opportunity, that cry for help, to identify these veterans and give them opportunities to get the therapeutic assistance intervention that you've been describing. But specifically, we're seeing Vietnam-era veterans who are retiring now that are manifesting sense of PTSD because employment was therapeutic. And yet we're seeing the ranks of our unemployment rolls being filled with veterans. Why aren't we giving them jobs and compensating at the same level we would for unemployment, rather than having at home depressed, thinking about their experiences and then self-medicating to the point that their lives ultimately become crippled?
And in the Senate in Canada, I went to the government and I said, how much did we spend in preparing and deploying, using, and bringing back the forces that were in Afghanistan? How many hundreds of billions did we do? And in case of Americans, trillion. How much did we spend on that? And then I said, how much are we spending now on securing these individuals who have done that in coming back into our society, transitioning into the civilian world, getting the benefits, the medical help, and all this? How much are we spending on that? And the answer that comes back is that, well, it's a different pot, and it's more difficult to explain, and it's harder to get the metrics, and on and on and on. And it is peanuts in comparison. So one of the arguments to assist this that I believe is going on, and the Dutch are fiddling with this now, is the fact that the cost of an operational theater is to include the whole backlog afterwards of not only maintenance of the vehicles that are come back and needed, but also the maintenance of the human beings and the families, and for that length of time. So to cost that, and to include that in the estimates, or whatever you call your terms, of the budgetary process. And until we get that, we will still get piecemeal support out there. Your comment about Vietnam vets, it is true. Operational stress injuries, PTSD, we are getting now NATO vets, even Korean vets, who are now finding themselves in the traumas of PTSD, and they're in their 70s, some in their 80s. It doesn't go away with age. Age doesn't make it easier. And there are studies that are talking about those who've been traumatized young will in fact see this exacerbate itself with age. Whether you built a prosthesis to handle it better, that depends on whether you realize that you have that injury. And so that transitioning, plus the fact that it is there and needs that long-term support, are elements that are still being fiddled with. You have 48,000 homeless veterans. That's incredible. The last time we had that many, and we in Canada, we've got an estimated about 4,000. The last time that was after World War II, when all the rubby-dubs, remember them? The rubby-dubs, the people in the street kids, were all young veterans with no care. And that's coming back. So between that and the judicial system that is not recognizing veterans as being injured and putting them through the mental health sort of judicial system, which are not punitive, but are in fact rehabilitative, and building that within your normal judicial system, not just the military one, but no. And we're working on they exist in the civilian world, courts that take care for mentally handicapped people. We want the veterans to be able to have access to those courts also, and keep them out of jail.